Beneath the scorching sun, across the sprawling golden fields of Georgia, an old black farmer named Elijah lived a simple yet honorable life. His hands were rough with years of labor, his back bent slightly from decades of tilling the stubborn earth. But his spirit, his spirit was strong and shining like the morning star. Elijah didn't have much in the way of material possessions. His little farm was modest, his house worn with love and time, but his heart? It was rich, richer than the wealthiest men in the county. Every morning before the rooster crowed, Elijah would pull on his muddy boots, tip his weathered hat, and begin his sacred dance with the soil. It was a quiet life, a life of communion with nature, a life where he found meaning in the smallest details, the buzzing of bees, the whispering of leaves, the gentle hum of life. One particular afternoon, as Elijah made his way back from the fields, something caught his eye near the edge of the dusty road. A small, trembling figure, covered in grime and thorns, struggled to stand. It was a dog, barely more than skin and bones, its ribs visible under a matted coat, its eyes hollow yet pleading. Elijah's heart clenched at the sight. He knelt down slowly, careful not to frighten the poor creature. "Hey there, little one," he murmured, his voice deep and tender, like the comforting rumble of distant thunder. The dog flinched at first, then, sensing the kindness in Elijah's soul, weakly wagged its tail. Without hesitation, Elijah scooped the starving dog into his arms. The animal was feather-light, a heartbreaking reminder of its suffering. Elijah could feel every trembling breath, every weak heartbeat against his chest. "You're safe now," he whispered, cradling the dog as he would a newborn child. At home, Elijah gently cleaned the dog's wounds, fed it broth with a spoon, and tucked it into a soft blanket near the fireplace. He named him Buddy, for in that moment, Elijah knew they had formed an unspoken bond, two souls crossing paths when they needed each other the most. Days turned into weeks, and Buddy grew stronger under Elijah's care. His eyes regained their sparkle, his coat began to shine, and his spirit blossomed like a flower kissed by rain after a drought. Buddy followed Elijah everywhere, across the fields, around the house, even to town on occasion. They were inseparable, two companions sharing a simple joy that words could scarcely capture. But there was always a question lingering in Elijah's mind. Where had Buddy come from? Who had left him to suffer alone in the wild? One Saturday morning, as Elijah and Buddy were walking through town to fetch supplies, something unusual happened. A sleek black car, far too fancy for their small town, pulled up alongside them. The windows rolled down, revealing a woman in a crisp navy suit with tear-filled eyes locked on Buddy. "That's him," she gasped, jumping out of the car. Buddy, sensing her presence, tensed up, his tail tucked between his legs. Elijah immediately placed a protective hand on the dog's back. The woman rushed forward, her voice trembling. "Please, sir, where did you find him?" Elijah, cautious but kind, replied, "He was by the roadside, ma'am. Looked like he hadn't eaten in days. I took him in." The woman knelt down, calling gently, "Max. Maxie, it's me, sweet boy." Buddy, Max, shook, caught between recognition and fear. It was clear there was a history here, a complicated one. Elijah watched closely. His instincts, honed by years of reading the land, the weather, and the hearts of men, told him something wasn't right. Buddy didn't lunge into her arms. He didn't bark joyfully or wag his tail like a long-lost pet would. He simply stood there, trembling. "Are you his owner?" Elijah asked, his voice calm but firm. Tears streamed down the woman's face as she nodded. "Yes and no," she whispered. "You see, he belonged to my father. He passed away 3 months ago. After that, Max ran away. We searched everywhere, but couldn't find him." She explained that her father, a retired war veteran, had lived on a large estate just outside the county. Max had been his therapy dog, a companion who had been by his side during the hardest nights. After her father's death, Max had slipped away, unable to bear the loss. Elijah listened, his heart softening yet cautious. He looked down at Buddy, at the way the dog pressed against his leg for security. "He's been through a lot," Elijah said quietly. "You can see it in his eyes." The woman nodded, reaching into her purse to show photos of her father and Max together. images of a happier time, full of life and love. It was then that Buddy, no Max, took a cautious step forward. He sniffed the air, recognizing the scent of his former life. His tail gave a timid wag. Elijah knelt beside him, whispering, "It's your choice, Buddy." Buddy looked between the two, his eyes speaking volumes of pain, loss, and hope. And just like that, he took another step toward the woman. Buddy stepped slowly toward the woman, his movements uncertain, like a traveler returning to a home that no longer quite feels like home. The woman knelt, arms wide open, her voice a soft whisper of longing. "Come here, baby." Buddy hesitated, his paws barely moving. He glanced back at Elijah, eyes wide, searching, questioning. It was as if he was asking, "Is it safe? Am I doing the right thing?" Elijah crouched down too, placing a gentle hand on Buddy's back. "It's all right, boy. Sometimes the past calls us back, and sometimes we find new beginnings," he said, his voice low and soothing like the rustle of the cotton fields. After a few moments that felt like an eternity, Buddy moved closer to the woman. She wrapped her arms around him, sobbing quietly into his fur. Elijah felt a pang in his heart, a bittersweet ache. He had grown attached to Buddy more than he realized. But he also understood that sometimes love means letting go. The woman stood, wiping her tears, and looked Elijah straight in the eye. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, voice breaking. "You saved him. You saved a piece of my father's soul." Elijah tipped his hat humbly. "He saved me too, in his own way," he murmured. Then came the unexpected. The woman hesitated, her hands trembling slightly. "Sir, I know this might sound strange, but would you come with us? At least to visit? Max. Buddy, he trusts you. And frankly, I could use some help understanding him. He's not the same as he used to be." Elijah was taken aback. Never had he imagined being asked into the life of someone who pulled up in a shiny car, someone who wore expensive clothes and carried herself like she belonged to another world altogether. But the sincerity in her eyes told him she wasn't offering out of pity. She was offering out of gratitude and perhaps a silent plea for healing. He looked down at his muddy boots, at his calloused hands, then back at Buddy's hopeful eyes. "All right," he said with a slow nod. "I'll come." The estate was a world apart from Elijah's modest farm. Grand iron gates swung open to reveal a sprawling property dotted with towering oak trees and gardens that seemed to have leapt straight out of a painting. The house was an old colonial mansion, its white pillars glowing against the setting sun. Elijah felt a bit out of place as they drove up the long winding driveway. His worn clothes and dusty hat stood in stark contrast to the polished wood floors and glistening chandeliers inside. But Buddy padded alongside him, tail wagging more freely now, giving him a kind of quiet courage. The woman, her name was Caroline, showed him around, sharing stories of her father. "He was a stubborn old thing," she said with a laugh. "But he loved Max more than anything in this world." She led Elijah into a study filled with mementos, military medals, old photographs, worn-out novels stacked haphazardly. There, in the center of the room, was a large framed photo of her father smiling broadly with Buddy, Max, by his side. Elijah took a slow breath. The love captured in that image was palpable. "We used to sit here," Caroline said, her voice soft. "Every night after dinner, Dad would tell Max everything. His hopes, his fears, his memories of the war. Max understood him in a way no one else could." There was a long pause. "I lost both of them when Dad passed," Caroline admitted, her eyes glistening. "And when Max disappeared, it felt like losing Dad all over again." Elijah listened quietly. Sometimes words weren't needed. Sometimes presence was enough. Buddy nosed at Elijah's hand, seeking reassurance. Elijah smiled, rubbing behind his ears. "Looks like he's already feeling more at home." Caroline offered him a seat. They sipped sweet tea as the evening wore on, swapping stories about Buddy's adventures on the farm, the time he had chased after a stubborn chicken, the day he had discovered a hidden patch of strawberries, the night he had curled up beside Elijah during a terrible thunderstorm. Through it all, Caroline laughed, cried, and laughed again, her walls crumbling piece by piece. "You don't know what you've given me," she said at last, her voice thick with emotion. You brought him back to me. You brought my father back to me. Elijah simply nodded, his heart full. As the clock ticked past midnight, Caroline hesitated once more before speaking. I have a crazy idea, she said. Would you consider staying on? Helping me with the grounds? Helping me with Max? This place is too big for just me. And Max clearly loves you. Elijah blinked, taken aback. His whole life had been the farm, the familiar rhythm of planting and harvesting, the simple solitude of country living. But looking into Caroline's hopeful face and Buddy's expectant eyes, he felt something stir deep within him. A new chapter, a new field to sow, a new family to tend. He smiled, slow and steady. I reckon I could do that, he said. And just like that, under a ceiling of ancient oak beams and the watchful gaze of a beloved photograph, 2 broken lives and 1 faithful dog began to weave themselves into a new story. A story of healing, of hope, and of the quiet miracles that bloom when kindness is sown in the soil of the human heart. Because sometimes the ones we rescue are the ones who rescue us right back. And Elijah knew, as he scratched Buddy's ears and listened to Caroline laugh, that he was exactly where he was meant to be. The next morning, Elijah stood at the edge of the vast gardens, the early sun stretching long shadows across the dewy grass. Buddy trotted happily beside him, his tongue lolling out, tail wagging in lazy circles. Caroline joined them, 2 mugs of steaming coffee in her hands. She offered one to Elijah, who accepted it with a grateful nod. I hope you like it strong, she said with a chuckle. Elijah took a sip and smiled. Stronger the better. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching as Buddy explored his new old territory, sniffing every flower bed and bush with great enthusiasm. You know, Caroline said thoughtfully, I always thought after losing Dad I had to handle everything alone. That being strong meant never needing anyone. Elijah turned to her, his gaze steady. Ain't weak to let others in. Sometimes that's the bravest thing you can do. Caroline looked down, a soft smile touching her lips. Maybe you're right. They spent the rest of the morning tending the gardens together. Elijah taught Caroline simple tricks, how to prune roses without hurting them, how to tell when soil needed more water just by the feel of it between her fingers. Buddy followed them everywhere, occasionally flopping down in a sunny patch to nap, only to jump up again whenever Caroline or Elijah called him. The laughter returned to the estate that day, not forced, but natural and healing. And it wasn't just Caroline who felt it. Elijah felt it too, deep down, like a seed finally breaking through tough ground, reaching toward the sun. As days turned into weeks, Elijah became a fixture at the estate. He fixed broken fences, mended old garden beds, repaired squeaky gates. And in return, Caroline opened her home to him, and more importantly, her heart. Buddy, of course, ruled over them both, dividing his loyalties equally, though he often ended up snuggling against Elijah by the fire on chilly evenings. One rainy afternoon, as thunder rolled lazily across the sky, Caroline pulled out a dusty old box from the attic. She called Elijah into the living room, her excitement evident. I found these, she said, placing the box on the coffee table. Inside were hundreds of photographs, many of them showing her father and Buddy during various stages of life, hiking, fishing, playing in the snow. But tucked in between them were even older photographs, black and white images of people standing proudly beside fields of cotton and corn. My family, Caroline said, her voice reverent. This land, it's been in my blood for generations. I guess I forgot that somewhere along the way. Elijah picked up a photo carefully. A man and woman, both dark-skinned, standing tall and proud before a wide-open field. They looked tired, but their eyes held something powerful, dignity. This was Elijah, Caroline said, pointing to the man. Your name reminded me of him. He was my great-grandfather's best friend. Helped him rebuild this place after the war. Elijah blinked, feeling a strange tightening in his chest. Fate? Coincidence? Or something deeper at work? Maybe it's no accident you found Max, or that you found us, Caroline said quietly. The rain tapped against the windows, a soft, steady rhythm. Elijah nodded slowly. He had always believed in signs, in the silent language of the universe that speaks through chance encounters and sudden twists of fate. Maybe, just maybe, he was meant to be here. One evening, a few months later, Caroline invited the entire town for a gathering. It was the first time in years that the grand old estate hosted an event. Neighbors, old friends, and even curious newcomers came, drawn by stories of the transformation taking place. Elijah stood near the grill, flipping burgers and ribs, while Buddy darted between guests, collecting pets and sneaking treats. People marveled at the gardens, now blooming wildly with vibrant colors. They marveled even more at how Caroline glowed with new energy and purpose. One elderly woman leaned in close to Elijah and whispered, "Never thought I'd see this place alive again. You did good, son." Elijah tipped his hat humbly, feeling a swell of pride he hadn't allowed himself in a long time. Later that night, under a canopy of stars, Caroline found him sitting on the porch steps, Buddy resting his head on Elijah's lap. She sat beside him, their shoulders brushing. "You know," she said, "this place was never really about the house or the land. It's about family, about roots. And somehow, you became part of that." Elijah chuckled softly. "Wasn't part of the plan." Caroline smiled. "The best things never are." They sat in silence, the night wrapping around them like a warm blanket. Fireflies blinked lazily across the lawn. The smell of the barbecue lingered in the air. Elijah scratched behind Buddy's ears, feeling a contentment he hadn't known he was missing. Maybe saving Buddy had been destiny's way of saving all of them, of mending old wounds, of building bridges where once there were only fences. Maybe, Elijah thought as he gazed up at the endless sky, some rescues are written in the stars long before we ever know we need them. And as Buddy let out a soft, happy sigh, Elijah knew one thing for sure. He was home. Weeks later, a letter arrived. It came on thick cream-colored paper, embossed with a gold seal. Caroline found it in the mailbox and rushed inside, waving it excitedly. "Elijah, come quick." Elijah wiped his hands on his jeans and met her at the kitchen table, where she tore the envelope open with trembling fingers. Inside was an invitation from the Historical Society of the county. They had heard about the restoration of the estate and wanted to honor it as a landmark of significant historical value, tracing back to times when black farmers and white landowners worked together to rebuild after the Civil War. Elijah leaned over the letter, his brows lifting in surprise. "They want us to speak at the event," Caroline said, looking up at him. "Both of us." Elijah took a slow breath. Public speaking wasn't exactly his idea of a good time. But one look at Caroline's hopeful eyes, and he knew he couldn't say no. "All right," he said with a slow grin. "But only if you do most of the talking." Caroline laughed, a musical sound that filled the room with warmth. "It's a deal." The night of the event arrived, and Elijah found himself standing in the grand old town hall, dressed in his best shirt and boots. The room was packed, townsfolk, historians, even news reporters. Caroline stood beside him, radiating calm confidence. She wore a simple, elegant dress, and her hair was pulled back in a neat bun. Buddy, freshly bathed and wearing a little red bow tie, sat patiently at Elijah's feet. When it was their turn to speak, Caroline took the podium first. She spoke about the history of the land, about her family's legacy, and about how, when everything seemed lost, a stranger and a dog had brought life back into their home. "And," she said, voice trembling slightly, "it taught me that help often comes from the most unexpected places. That kindness can bridge divides time tries to deepen. And that sometimes family isn't just who you're born with, it's who you choose." There was a soft murmur of agreement from the crowd. Then she gestured for Elijah to join her. Elijah stepped forward slowly. He cleared his throat, feeling every eye in the room on him. "I ain't much for speeches," he began, earning a few chuckles. "But I reckon Caroline's right. Sometimes it don't matter where you come from or how different folks think you are. It matters what's in your heart and what you're willing to fight for." He looked down at Buddy, who wagged his tail encouragingly. "I didn't know when I found this old dog that he'd lead me to a new life. But he did, and he reminded me that loyalty, trust, and a little bit of hope can change everything." Applause thundered through the hall, and Elijah felt a lump rise in his throat, the good kind. Maybe he hadn't just saved Buddy. Maybe Buddy had saved him, too. After the event, the mayor approached them, offering his hand warmly. "You've done this town proud," he said. "We're better for having you here, Elijah." Elijah shook his hand, feeling a genuine sense of belonging settle deep inside him. Over the next few days, word spread. People who once barely nodded at Elijah now stopped to chat. Kids waved at him from bikes. Neighbors dropped off pies and casseroles. It wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about connection, the invisible thread that wove people together when they dared to open their hearts. Buddy became somewhat of a local celebrity himself. He was given honorary membership at the town's little animal shelter, and kids took turns reading to him during Saturday story hours. As for Elijah and Caroline, they continued tending the gardens, side by side. They planted new seeds, literal and metaphorical, building something that would last far beyond their lifetimes. Sometimes in the quiet evenings, Elijah would sit on the porch, Buddy's head in his lap, and watch the sunset paint the sky with strokes of gold and crimson. And he'd think about that day, all those months ago, when he found a starving dog on the side of the road, and how that simple act of kindness had set everything in motion. Funny how life works, he mused. Sometimes you set out to rescue a soul, and end up rescuing yourself. One crisp autumn evening, as the leaves danced across the farmyard and the air smelled of wood smoke, Caroline brought out an old photo album she found tucked away in the attic. "Elijah," she called, "you have to see this." Curious, Elijah set down his tools and followed her inside. They sat together at the worn kitchen table as she flipped open the cracked leather cover. Inside were black and white photographs, some faded, some sharp, telling stories without words. Caroline pointed to a particular photo, a black man standing beside a white farmer, both smiling, both covered in dirt and sweat from a day's work. "My great-grandfather," she said softly, "and his best friend, Samuel." Elijah leaned in, recognizing something familiar in the expressions of the two men, the bond, the trust. "They worked this land together," Caroline continued. "They built it up after everything fell apart. They didn't let the world tell them they had to be enemies." She turned the page and found another photo, this time of a young girl sitting on a porch with a big hound sleeping at her feet. Buddy barked softly, as if recognizing a distant relative. "Guess dogs have always been part of this story," Elijah said with a chuckle. Caroline smiled, tracing the image with her fingertips. "I think they knew. Love doesn't come with conditions. It doesn't see color or class or mistakes. It just is." Elijah felt something stir deep inside him, a quiet knowing that they were part of something much bigger than themselves. A legacy not built with bricks or dollars, but with open hands and open hearts. That night, they placed a photo album on the mantel above the fireplace, right next to a framed picture of Buddy, the little dog who had, without trying, brought a broken history full circle. Outside, the stars began to shimmer in the wide, velvet sky. The land slept peacefully, wrapped in the promise of new beginnings. And inside the old farmhouse, love lived, stubborn, enduring, and stronger than any storm. All because a black farmer stopped on a dusty road. All because he chose to care. All because kindness, once given, has a way of growing roots deeper than hatred ever could. The end.